Hi everyone, my name's Michaela. Bit of background, I like to get different perspectives in education. I've worked across the sector in various guises, which has brought me to where I am now, working at RMIT. But these are some of my key interests at the moment. And the topic that I'll go into a bit more is something that I've been starting to think about really over the last couple of years, and I've become quite fascinated in evidence in education. So let's get started. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a turkey. Now, I ran through this presentation with my partner this morning, and when I said this to him, he started gawping like a turkey. Feel free to do whatever you want to do while you're imagining this. But as a turkey, each day you're fed by the friendly members of the human race. And every day that you are fed firms up your belief that human beings have your best interests at heart. Now, this is what your life looks like. This variable on the y-axis is your well-being, and you can see day after day, your well-being's increasing on a slight increase. So this keeps on going as you continue to be fed and looked after by those caring human beings. That is until day 1001, when something unexpected happens. Thanksgiving. Sadly, your life as a turkey ends. And at that point, you experience a sudden revision of your beliefs. Now, what's the moral of this story? So this particular example comes from an author called Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote a book called The Black Swan. And in this book, he explained that hidden evidence can change the story entirely. For the turkey, their perspective of life had one worldview. But for humans, that turkey's role in life looks quite different. Now, I'm not here to talk to you about turkeys. I'm here primarily to discuss education. But just like turkeys, we're actually blind to evidence. And this comes from ignoring what's hard to measure and also from what we don't believe. So what's hard to measure, when we ignore those harder to measure things, this is bound up in something known as the McNamara fallacy, which is a tendency to make decisions based on easily quantifiable constructs. So what's easy to measure and ignoring all other evidence. So I'll give you an example. Imagine that you want to try out a new practice in the classroom, so you go and implement it one lesson, and then at the end of the lesson, you give your students a test to see if they've learnt anything. And actually that test shows that your students haven't learnt anything. A few weeks later, however, you overhear some students talking and you realise that actually they had picked up some things from that lesson, and there's quite a lot of information that they'd retained. If you'd made your decision about that classroom practice based solely on the test results at the end of that lesson, you would have been missing out on some quite important information. And that's what often happens when we look at the short-term gains from an intervention and ignore those harder to measure long-term benefits. Now let's consider our beliefs. Confirmation bias. Some of you will have heard of this. It's the tendency to embrace information that supports your beliefs and reject information that contradicts them. So this time I want you to think about a scenario where you've got a classroom of students, and in this class you've got one student who you would consider to be strong, perhaps even academically gifted. And that student sits an assessment where you would expect them to do well, but actually they do quite poorly. And you conclude from that, that was bad luck. They're just having a bad day, really. In that same class, you've got a student who you'd consider to be weak, who struggles and is usually quite slow to pick up things. And on that same assessment, this student also does poorly. But this time you conclude, well, that's kind of what I expected them to do anyway. Now, you might be listening to this and be thinking, well, I wouldn't, be susceptible to that. I wouldn't have confirmation bias in that situation. That may be so. However, all of us, even when we are aware of this bias, do fall prey to it at one point or another. So I want to look a bit more at both of these constructs, confirmation bias and the McNamara fallacy, in some actual examples that have played out in Australian media in recent months. Now, unless you've been living in a media vacuum, you've probably come across government talk about wanting to ban mobile phones in classrooms. And this particular media release comes from the Victorian Department of Education. And they put forward a few pieces of evidence about why they thought mobile phones should be banned. So firstly, they stated that a large proportion of young Australians are actually experiencing cyberbullying. They also stated that there are concerns that mobile phones cause distractions in the classroom. Now, what's hard to measure here is whether mobile phones actually cause cyberbullying. And actually, what causes cyberbullying or any sort of bullying at all? What's also being ignored is whether mobile phones can produce any sort of benefit at school, whether they can lead to positive learning outcomes. So for example, when they're used as a calculator, when they're used for publishing or some other sort of resourceful support. And when you take into account this information that's been ignored or that is actually hard to measure, the situation that's been presented here can actually look quite different. And the argument that's being put forward perhaps isn't the right one. Here's another example. This time this comes from the New South Wales Department of Education, who recently put forward this piece to the media that they're planning to make maths compulsory for all students up to the end of Year 12. The evidence the department put forward is that maths is important throughout our lives and that parents want their students to leave school as mathematically literate. And so let's think about this a bit more. What's been ignored here is the situation of what's currently happening for those Year 10 students who are choosing not to continue with maths beyond the end of that year. What's happening with them in that trajectory up until Year 10 that's making them decide, actually, maths isn't for me. This important subject isn't for me for these final 2 years of school. What's hard to measure is whether an additional 2 years of maths is what will make the difference for these students, or whether there's actually a more expedient initiative that could be implemented that could get towards the same goals. So just like the first example, here we've got a situation where particular evidence is being presented in a particular way to communicate a narrative that this body is wanting us to infer. And I'll just quickly leave you with some take-home lessons. So firstly, each piece of evidence is only a part of the overall story. Think of the turkey. And this occurs even for robust, well-designed research. I'm not just talking about the government media releases, but even for researchers, they are susceptible to confirmation bias, and they may look for those easily quantifiable constructs, those measurement tools that are easy to use. And for you, the thing I leave you with, because I think I like to leave you with something to go away with beyond this, is to consider when you're presented with something, instead of accepting it at face value and unquestionably, think about those conclusions. Step back and think about, well, actually, what's the bigger picture that's being presented here? Thanks.